It might even be a little bit early. We're two minutes early, but everybody's enthusiastic, so let me get us underway. On behalf of both New College communities, I'd like to issue a warm welcome to everyone who is here present in this room this evening, and also about approximately an equivalent number joining us by Facebook live stream. So welcome. A special welcome to Professor Peter Harrison. I've lost sight of him. I assume he's still here. He's up the back. Okay, we haven't lost our lecturer. That's great. Who's our lecturer for 2025? I'll say a few more words in a moment. Let me begin by respectfully acknowledging the Bidjigal people as the traditional custodians of these lands and pay my respects to elders past and present. This country has always been a place of teaching, learning and knowledge sharing, and that continues today. I honour the enduring connection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to this land, culture and community. I recognise the ongoing presence and contributions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and commit myself to listening, learning and walking together with them. I'd like to acknowledge my fellow trustees, the Right Reverend Dr Michael Stead, Bishop of South Sydney, and Emeritus Professor David Cohen, who is the immediate past President of the University of New South Wales Academic Board. I'd also like to acknowledge former board members, Reverend Dr Robert Doyle and Dr Louis Chubb, also with Dr Peter Chubb, and our much beloved Emeritus Professor Christine Alexander, who's Life Fellow of New College. And look, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd just like to acknowledge some other special guests amongst us. You're not meant to have favourites, but two of my favourites are Professor Chris and Jan Bellinger, former master and wife at Robert Menzies College, the sister college of New College at Macquarie Uni. Chris and Jan have been great support to me over these pretty difficult years, over the last few years. Dr Greg Clark, former Director of the Centre for Christian Apologetic Scholarship and Education here at New College. We've got a number of representatives of different universities. Emeritus Professor Michael Knight, AM of UTS, who's an associate of mine by virtue of our work on Australian water resources. Sarah Sweet from the University of Queensland, Dr Roberta Kwan from Macquarie University, Mark Hutchinson from Western Sydney University, Dr Peter Stiles of Excelsior, Professor Ben Myers from Alpha Crucis, Stephen Bray from Morling, and Reverend Dr Stephen and Veronica Pym from Christ College. And we've also got some senior representatives of the university residential colleges. Dr Xavier Simmons is the Master of Rain College and Director of the Plunkett Centre at the Australian Catholic University. Lucy Williams is joining us from St Paul's College, and Caitlin McDonald from St Andrews College at the University of Sydney. I want to express my appreciation to those people with the ambition of making great university colleges in this country. Also, Dr James Peach, Principal of Innerborough and former Dean of Residence here at New College. These are my acknowledgements, but I assure you that everyone here and everyone listening online is important, because as the ageing Master of New College, I'm very conscious that it's not about now. These lectures are about the future, and the younger amongst us are especially important. If you haven't been to New College before, again, welcome. By way of brief explanation, this is the original New College. It's got an amazing and long track record of outstanding academic achievement here at the University of New South Wales. And look, let me invite you to come back for the college review, which happens in a few weeks' time, when the students of this college will be putting their creative skills on display. We also have our postgraduate village across Anzac Parade. There's about 315 students in our postgraduate village. It's developing a remarkable track record of its own. We've got about 50 doctoral students and postdoctoral fellows in residence there. It's a very exciting time for that college. And we've got about 7,000 alumni who've been students with us within our colleges. So, look, if you want to follow the story more closely, there's actually copies of the New College history on sale over here, so you can perhaps have a look at that later. We're affiliated with the University of New South Wales. We're also affiliated and part of the Anglican Diocese here in Sydney. These lectures are a service to the community of Australia. We run a small research group called the Centre for Christian Apologetics, Scholarship and Education. Dr Danny Scarrett up the back and Reverend Dr AJ Culp and I are co-authors of a quarterly journal, which is called, unsurprisingly, Case Quarterly. There are copies available over here for inspection later, and I'd like to pay tribute to Danny and AJ for their collegiality and the role they play here with the lectures as well. Look, there are some excellent books on sale over here, and some of them have been selected because they're particularly relevant to the topics that we're talking about over the next 3 nights. There are also copies of Some New World, which is Peter's latest publication. Questions, questions, questions. Questions are an important part of the New College lectures, and so I'm not sure what's on that screen, but I know it's on that screen, and maybe it can come on this screen. You might, if you're willing to turn your heads, you can either scan that QR code or type in that URL, and that will actually take you to a place where you can ask questions at the end of this lecture. And I would really like to encourage you to take that opportunity now, because that will actually enable you as the lecture progresses to actually post questions, so we can really get into the question time when we get to that point. If you don't want to use a smartphone and you want a more analogue method, please just put your hand up at any time and one of our helpful staff will come and give you a piece of paper and a pencil and then collect it so you can write the question down. But we're prepared to do both methods. Look, you might find that's a bit impersonal, but we've actually found that actually makes question time really spin along. And look, I've been to a couple of academic conferences in the last 12 months where it's been used to good effect there as well. Students, if you're here, I particularly encourage you to ask a question, because as I used to say to my engineering students, if you've got a question, you can guarantee there's 10 others in the room that have probably got the same question, and they wish they could ask it. So take the opportunity. Fire alarms, I just de-isolated the fire system, so it is active. Now, if there's a fire alarm, we head out to my left, your right, and we go across the road and over to where there's a grandstand overlooking the field. Bathrooms are on this corridor on my right, your left. And look, before our lecturer comes to speak to us, I'm just going to give us a little bit of brief background as to how we sort of ended up here tonight. University of New South Wales is a liberal arts university, and I was an engineering student here many years ago, and I was able to study philosophy of religion as part of the general studies subjects. And the lecturer at the time faithfully discussed first order and second order religious experiences as part of the subject material in that subject. Sadly, that subject's gone, and as I speak to students across all the faculties of UNSW, I think I can honestly say there's not been much admission of religious considerations in the university curriculum over the past 10 years that I've been here. Perhaps it's just me, but that's been my experience. Similarly, I wrote about wellbeing in Christian communities back in 2017, which is part of Case Quarterly, and I used the 2010 edition of an international monograph on community psychology. And the 2010 edition had a very, very strong Marxist flavour. They were very negative about any religious contribution to discussion of well-being or community psychology. Came back to a 2017 edition, and it was far more positive about religious organisations and their good work in society. We seem to stand in a strange place. Where is God in relation to our contemporary secular university, or for that matter in our understanding of society in general? Another example. So my present research has taken me on a journey from engineering towards ecology, and most of my dealings with my ecological colleagues have been purely Darwinian. There's no reference to God or spirituality in the practice of ecology. However, the last 2 biological conferences I've been to, one in Australia and one in the US, both featured a section on two-eyed seeing. the idea that in ecology, the Darwinian view is not enough. And you need a spiritual insight, probably of an indigenous nature, to actually incorporate in your understanding of the environment. We live in some strange times. Early this year, I was afforded the opportunity to read Some New World, and it was as if Peter Harrison had opened a window for me. I had a long-standing knowledge of false dichotomies between science and religious belief, but Peter was able to place in that book for me an overarching historical story which, sorted out for me some of these strange behaviours I'd observed in universities and beyond. So I strongly believe that Peter should be given the opportunity to share his insights publicly. I consulted my fellow lectures trustees and they agreed, and Peter very kindly agreed to come and deliver our lectures. Professor Peter Harrison is a research fellow at the University of Notre Dame here in Sydney, and he's also Emeritus Professor of History and Philosophy at the University of Queensland. Before joining Notre Dame, he was the Director of the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Queensland. And for the geeks among us who have worked in universities, from 2014 to 2019, he was an Australian Laureate Fellow, which is probably about the highest research position you can aspire to in this country. And prior to that, he was the Indrios Professor of Science and Religion and the Director of the Ian Ramsay Centre at the University of Oxford. He's been a visiting fellow at Yale, Princeton, Otago, the University of Chicago, and he's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities. He's a founding member of the International Society for Science and Religion and a corresponding member of the International Academy of the History of Science. In 2011, he delivered the Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh, and in 2019, he gave the Bampton Lectures at the University of Oxford, and of course, he delivered our own New College Lectures back in 2014. I count 10 or more books that he's written, including Some New World. He is an international authority on history, philosophy and the humanities, and we're greatly privileged to hear from him at New College tonight. Before he comes to address us, I would just like to pray, if you'd like to join me. Dear Heavenly Father, as we meet here this evening, we thank you for the freedom we have in this country to discuss important matters of belief and faith without fear. We pray for your blessing now upon our lecturer this evening, that you would grant him clarity of thought and expression. Please grant to us all knowledge of you and a better understanding of you and your ways in this world. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Please join me in welcoming Professor Harrison to address us.
Well, thanks, Bill, for that welcome, and thanks to you for coming along this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. To some extent, I should say this is a work in progress. Bill put to me the possibility of linking some of the ideas in Some New World to the question about the status of our universities, what's wrong with them and where they need to go. And I've been mulling that over since we had that conversation. So what I want to present to you tonight is really, as I say, a work in progress. My ideas about experimentally combining some of the conceptions in that book that were essentially about the processes of the secularisation of Western society, the loss of religion, the loss of meaning from our culture, and what that means for our forms of knowledge. Now, before I go too much further, I probably should get a clicker so that we can get off this very first slide, because I can't actually talk without the slides. But I can... No, I won't talk without the slides. Oh, is it possible for me to great. Thanks, Chris. There's a big button in the middle. Okay. So, we're going to talk about medieval beginnings. Let's start in the present, though. If you type the words universities in crisis into a search engine, you'll get more than 150 million results. I'm pretty sure. Now, I haven't read all of those results, but as any undergraduate will tell you, that's what ChatGPT is for. And ChatGPT tells me this. Universities worldwide are navigating a crisis of funding, enrolment, governance, trust and relevance. There they are. I think that pretty well sums it up. And we might take the deliverances of ChatGPT with a grain of salt, but I think anyone who's been paying attention would agree that our universities are in trouble. There's the familiar crisis of the humanities, but increasingly we also have scepticism about science and more recently some quite explicit worrying attacks on scientific institutions and scientific credibility. These correlate with a growing public distrust in the universities. This data taken from the US, but I think it will apply equally in Australia. This growth in the public distrust in our universities, I think, is related to contested views about what universities should be teaching, with conservative voices expressing concern that universities have abandoned a commitment to core values of the Western tradition. On the other side of the political spectrum, we have demands that universities broaden what's perceived to be a narrow and exclusionary focus, and that they encompass perspectives offered by underrepresented, colonised and Indigenous peoples. If we move from outsiders' perspectives to insiders' perspectives, there's a growing disenchantment amongst academic staff, with one recent measure suggesting that 50% of academic staff in Australian universities are so alienated from their institutions that they're considering leaving the profession. Some of them, in fact, have no choice. And as we've seen again, if you've been reading the newspapers, there have been mass layoffs of academic staff at universities in our country. Even more concerning, I think, is something of an epidemic of mental health issues in the student body. So this is from a report on student mental health conducted in Victoria that says that a survey of Australian students found that about 28% reported high psychological distress and 30% low psychological well-being. It's not surprising, given this, that the dropout rate amongst Australian undergraduates currently sits at about 1 in 4. Now, given that publication is one of the occupational hazards of academia, it's not surprising that academics have written books about this. And of course, it's mostly from their own perspective. But here are some of the recent books that have been written just about the Australian situation. And I think Graham Turner's book is on sale at the bookshop there. Graham Turner, his book, Broken, is the most recent one. Now, I think these books do an excellent job of laying out what we might call the immediate causes of the problems with our university. And they typically highlight what we might say as the inept or indifferent government policies. And indeed, in some instances, these actually stretch to vindictive. Another problem they highlight is top-down corporate management, and the way in which universities are governed, with a concentration of decision-making in the upper echelons of the university, exacerbated by a proliferation of PVCs and DVCs and portfolios of various kinds. So I recommend you take a look at these. In this lecture series, however, I'm going to just step back from that kind of analysis of the more immediate or proximate causes of the present crisis of the universities. And I want to look at the broader question about how this crisis might be understood in relation to longer-term social changes, and as I've already indicated, especially those linked with secularisation or the decline of the influence of religion in our culture. And what I'm hoping to offer here is not so much an alternative account, but rather add a deeper explanatory layer to the layers that we see in these books. And this might not yield a set of immediately implementable solutions to our problems, although I do think there are certain policy implications that follow. But what, at the very least, I hope to do is to give us a greater understanding of our present predicament. And indeed, understanding is the primary role of what the primary function of what the humanities do. Okay, so I'm doing my humanities thing here. One point of connection with these analyses here, though, and it's worth highlighting this at the outset, is the notion of the good, or the public good, which you'll see is represented in the titles of 3 of the 4 books there. And in keeping with this theme, University of Sydney's recent fundraising campaign is called For Good. Now, these references to the good, or good, highlight the fact that ultimately questions about the function and purpose of our university come back to questions of the things we value as a society, which is to say, what is our conception of the good? But there have been major historical shifts in what we imagine the good to consist in. And I think there is now unprecedented disagreement about what counts as good. And what follows from that is that if you're mounting an argument about what universities ought to be doing based on a conception of the good, it's going to be very difficult to get traction because we no longer have a shared conception of what things are good. So arguments based on the intrinsic good of universities or university education tend to assume values that turn out not to be widely shared, or perhaps are vestiges of a previous era. Appeals to instrumental goods, and what I mean by that is what universities are good for, and that's a different kind of argument to universities being good in themselves. Arguments about what universities are good for actually turn out to require, nonetheless, some ultimate conception of the good because, as the Greek philosopher Aristotle pointed out some time ago, we'll come back to him, arguments for intrinsic good always are the things that underlie arguments for instrumental goods, good for. In other words, good for arguments still need an underlying conception of good in itself. So we can't postpone that question indefinitely. Now, one perspective that I'll adopt, and I hasten to add that it's not the only perspective, is to use a historical approach. Bill said this is about the future. It's also about the past, okay? And tonight it's going to be mostly about the past, but I hope to show this is directly relevant to the present and to the future. So as a starting point, I think it's useful to think comparatively about the only other institution in the West that is as old as our universities, and in fact it's older than our universities, and that is the Christian Church. Since the 19th century, according to secularisation theory, Christianity has suffered a crisis of legitimacy that's similar in some respects to that undergone by universities. And in fact, to some extent, perhaps in reverse order, it's the same set of problems. So it's possible then that there will be structural similarities between what's happening in these two venerable institutions in Western society. More importantly, though, and to return to the question of what we ultimately value, the question of the good, Western Christianity once provided a model of what an appeal to intrinsic good looked like, as also did the Greek philosophical tradition that feeds into the Christian tradition. To a significant degree, Christianity also brought with it a degree of consensus about what the good is. And until well into the 19th century, certain value propositions, including those relating to the value of a university education, were simply taken for granted. Even today, these values often continue to inform the discussion, even if not in explicit or obvious ways. But a decline in the role of religion in the public sphere, and this is one of the key markers of what I'm calling secularisation, has made appeals to intrinsic value more difficult because, as I've said before, it's no longer obvious that these values are universally shared. And so we get no leverage by making these appeals because, as I say, they're not common. Now, this historical shift in what the good consists in is marked by the rise of a particular approach to ethics called utilitarianism. I'm going to discuss this in much more detail in the third lecture, so don't worry too much about that. But basically, utilitarianism focuses on ends or outcomes. It focuses on the question of good for. It's a relatively modern approach to ethics that wants to think about the goodness of what we do in terms of the results it yields. And that moral approach contrasts with two more traditional approaches to do with virtues or duties. And those virtues or duties are essentially about the kind of people that we are. And what I want to suggest to you over these three lectures in part is that the conflict between these two conceptions of what the good is about, whether it's about generating particular results or whether it's about generating a particular kind of person, a person of virtue or a person who understands what duties they have, that really lies at the heart of some of the discussions about what university educations are attempting to do. And that's a distinction between good for, a utilitarian approach, and good in itself, which I think these more traditional approaches represent. Now, another reason that I'm looking at secularisation as the frame for understanding what's going on in our universities is that secularisation is linked to what I will call the rise of instrumental rationality. I'm going to talk more about this in lecture 3, but so keep that thought in mind. But just looking ahead, I want to make brief reference to the thought of the sociologist Max Weber, whose idea of secularisation was that it involves a disenchantment of the world. And this was more than just the removal of religion from the world, but it was accompanied by the rise of a particular kind of reasoning, a rational, calculative, scientific approach to human affairs that fed naturally into using bureaucracies to determine what goes on in our institutions. Now, I just want to flag that because I'm going to talk more about it in lecture 3. But in my view, this understanding of secularisation and its link to bureaucracy was both profound and prophetic, foreseeing, I think, with uncanny accuracy, the utilitarianism, the bureaucratisation, the hyperspecialisation, the use of measurement by metrics that anyone who's worked in a public university will be intimately familiar with. So secularisation is more than just the removal of religion from society. It's its replacement by a particular way of thinking. And again, that then I think helps us understand the predicament of the modern university. The historian of science and philosophy, Stephen Gaukroger, who sadly died 2 years ago but previously worked at the University of Sydney and is much missed by all of us, used to speak about the emergence of a scientific culture, which entailed the reduction of all of our values to a form of scientific rationality. And that's the process that I'm interested in tracing and the impacts that it has. And related to this is a rise in a naturalistic conception of how things work. And this naturalistic conception is one that removes conceptions of the supernatural from the picture. Now, the argument will be then that these aspects of secularisation have had a largely underappreciated impact on the universities and how we understand education. So, to move on then to the topic of this evening, that's it, 4 points. Aristotle. Why am I starting with a Greek philosopher whose dates you can see there, 384 BC? That's a long time ago. Here's the reason. If you went to university in the 17th century, this guy would be on the curriculum. And if you think about a set of ideas in terms of their historical influence, there's actually nothing that compares to that, right? That for over 1,000 years, this person's thought dominated how knowledge was understood, and as we'll see, from the very beginning of universities, this guy's thought was at the centre of the curriculum. He then set up the agenda for how we understand knowledge, and everything that has come after him has in some sense been a response to his conceptions of knowledge. The philosopher Whitehead used to say that the whole of Western history is a footnote to Plato, that other famous Greek philosopher. My suggestion here is that our discussions of education are all footnotes to Aristotle. So I'm afraid I'm going to bore you with Aristotle for the next 10 minutes or so, possibly 15 minutes or so, because I think, as I say, he's the guy who sets the agenda, and it's important to understand what he had to say. Although you'll see it's a little bit complicated. There won't be a test, and there's room for questions at the end. All men, that's what he says in the Greek, so we have to run with it. All men by nature desire to know. That's the opening lines of one of Aristotle's most celebrated works. It might seem a bit banal and uninformative, but as we unpack it, as Aristotle does over the several books of this important work, we'll see how this simple proposition underpins how we understand the goals of education. And the key thing here is that according to Aristotle, human beings have a distinctive nature, and that distinctive nature is driven towards particular goals, or ends as he calls them, and the chief goal to which human beings are naturally directed, Aristotle says, is knowledge. So the essence of human nature is the movement towards knowledge. And when we move towards our natural goals, Aristotle says, that's how we achieve happiness, right? So the whole point of life for Aristotle is that we move ourselves towards what is our natural end. It's intrinsic to our natures, and insofar as we move towards that, we become fulfilled as human beings, fulfilled in our essence, and we become happy. Now, what are the kinds of knowledge that we aspire to? So he's a philosopher, he's going to complicate it and tease it out. Aristotle says, and this is a pretty reasonable way of dividing things up, three kinds of knowledge. There's productive knowledge, which is the knowledge we use to make things. There's practical knowledge, which we use to inform our actions, ethics, or politics, or we can actually add economics there. And then theoretical knowledge, which is knowledge for its own sake. Okay. And for Aristotle, this actually reflects a kind of hierarchy. So the most important form of knowledge is the most abstract, and the most useful form of knowledge is the least important, right? And we have practical knowledge or ethics sitting in the middle. Now, let's not get too excited. I won't go into that just yet. So, as I've said, let's go into that. He then divides theoretical knowledge into three parts: natural philosophy or physics, and this is really the equivalent to what we would call natural science. Then we have mathematics, which is mathematics. And then we have what he calls theology. And this is Aristotle's idea of theology, not quite the same as Christian theology, but close enough in many respects. And the way he divides these up is that the things that natural philosophy or physics is concerned with are material things, okay? The most concrete things. What theology is concerned with is the opposite of that in every respect. And these things are the things that are invisible, intangible, eternal, unchanging, right? The complete opposite to the things that physics studies. And mathematics, he says, is in the middle. Okay, so invisible and incorporeal things, but typically associated with the material things. So just to rehearse it, Aristotle says 3 kinds of knowledge: productive, practical and theoretical. And theoretical is further divided up on the basis of the objects of the things that we study. And there's a hierarchy here as well. So just as the theoretical knowledge is at the top of the tree, theology is at the top of the tree because it deals with the most elevated kinds of things that there are. And more than that, for Aristotle, the educative process is a staged process where we begin with the lower things, the most tangible of natural philosophy, then mathematics, and then we proceed on to theology. So there's a hierarchy. Now, for Aristotle, this hierarchy is also reflected in history. So that in the intellectual development of the human race, Aristotle says, we start with the practical, productive things. As societies progress, they then move on to ethics and politics and economics. And the most advanced societies of all deal with the theoretical sciences and theology. Aristotle says it was the Egyptian priests who first got onto this, and the reason they did was that they had the leisure to do it. Because they had the productive nailed and they had the ethical, economics sorted out, they had the leisure then to move on to the highest forms of knowledge that involve these theoretical speculations. Okay, so in a sense then, rather than equipping us for work, the whole goal of life was to get beyond that, to reflect on the things in our leisure time that involve the most elevated things that there are, which are ultimately the divine things. And I think the last thing that we can say about Aristotle that's going to be relevant to us is that this reflection on the theoretical things, he says, is the activity of God, okay? So insofar as we engage in theoretical contemplation, for Aristotle, we become godlike. And that is the aim of Greek philosophy, right? It's not about logic and all. So forget, if you've ever done Philosophy 101, forget that. It's got nothing to do with what the ancients thought philosophy was about, which was to live a life that enabled you to become godlike. Ask any ancient person what the goal of philosophy is, it's to become godlike. And what's interesting is that in Christianity, this vision of what the Christian life was about was adopted as well. And if you ask people in the Greek Orthodox tradition, what is the chief end of man, they won't tell you what the Westminster Confession says. They will say it is to become godlike, theosis. Okay? So that's the goal. Now, where's that quote gone? There it is. Okay. It's worth saying, though, at this point, right? It's worth saying at this point, there's a difference between Aristotle's God and the Christian God, because Aristotle's God does nothing else but contemplate. But if we think about the Christian God actually is a creative God who makes stuff, right? So the Aristotelian principle we might agree with to become godlike, but it also depends on what your conception of God is, what being godlike consists in, okay? And this will make an important difference, because the idea that the Christian God is a creative God means that if the goal of life is to become godlike, perhaps the productive sciences aren't so bad after all. Aristotle's God was not a creator God, right? That messing around with matter was not the kind of thing he would do. But the Christian God does. So I suppose I want to say two things. Well, I'll say a number of things. but let me give you the bottom line here. For Aristotle, our conceptions of knowledge are tied to two things. A view of human nature, right? That's what you need. And absent a view of human nature, it's not clear what your theory about education or the goals of knowledge are going to be. But also his conception of God is relevant as well, insofar as that he thinks human fulfilment lies in some sense in becoming godlike. But here again the variable, just as human nature is a variable, there's also a variable at what our conception of God is going to be like. So I said I'd give you 5 minutes. We probably had 10 minutes on Aristotle, so let's just sum up the various points. Aristotle's understanding of knowledge and the relations between its forms is based on a goal-oriented conception of human nature, okay? And human happiness consists in following those goals. As we've seen, there's a hierarchy of the forms of knowledge, with knowledge for its own sake the most important. Crudely put, intellectual pursuits outrank ethical pursuits, which outrank practical activities or vocational training. Within the theoretical sciences, natural philosophy or physics ranks lower than mathematics, which ranks lower than what Aristotle calls theology. And it's Aristotle who makes theology the most dignified of the sciences. Okay? Related to this, there's no sense of a divide between secular or naturalistic knowledge and theological knowledge. There's just a logical continuum that we move from the sciences, as it were, through mathematics to theology. Just a natural continuum. And finally then, there's a connection between leisure and the higher forms of knowledge. So far from fitting us for forms of work, the whole point of knowledge is it's just something that we do once we are beyond work in that productive sense. And that's the very notion of the liberal arts, which are the arts of the person who is free and liberal and has the time to think. Now, before moving to the Middle Ages, because I did say we're going to talk about the medieval universities, I want to come back to this point about the continuing influence of Aristotelian thought. But before we get to the Middle Ages, here is an Aristotelian thinker from late antiquity who's called Simplicius, and he kind of sums up, I think, rather well the Aristotelian package. This guy is, as I say, he's a Neoplatonic. He's the last of the Neoplatonic philosophers. He's not a Christian thinker. He's actually opposed to Christianity, but here is his conception of how knowledge works. Physics is useful because it's practical, but most important of all, it gives us a reverence for divine things, and it awakens us to the majesty of God, and that, in a sense, is again that the knowledge of physical things moves us on to the path of knowledge of God. Okay. And Simplicius says this is what both Plato and Aristotle taught. Okay, so I hope you've got some sense of how Aristotle thinks about knowledge, and then this is going to be imported into the medieval universities that I want to talk about now. So the first universities began in Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries. Precisely when and where, it depends on what you define a university as, and most of the universities emerged out of existing educational institutions. But there's a general consensus that the University of Bologna was the first university established around 1088, followed by the University of Paris around 1150, and these two universities provided the models for the rest, including the English universities, Oxford, which kicks off in 1167, and the other place, which started in 1209. The universities were remarkably successful institutions, And by the year 1500, there were about 80 universities in various sites of Europe, as you can see there. Why did the universities take off in the 11th and 12th centuries? Well, there's a very kind of simple materialistic account that over the course of the 11th century we see population growth and increasing urbanisation. There were major ecclesiastical reforms, and this gave rise to a growing demand for an educated civil and ecclesiastical hierarchy, and this demand outstripped what the local schools could provide. So there were new cities, new urban centres, and there were more tightly defined divisions of labour, and this included the divisions of labour between students and teachers. So what happened was that scholars and students organised themselves into guilds or corporations similar to today's trade unions, we would say, and these corporations provided the basis of the very first universities. Now, the corporate structure of the universities, the guild structure of the universities, meant that they were really quite independent. And I think these first medieval universities, for the first several hundred years, were more independent than universities have ever been ever since. And this is because of the power of what we call the union movements of either the students or the staff. So students and staff could use their collective bargaining power to extract privileges from the places in which they operated. So in 1217, to give you an example, students at Bologna withdrew from the town. They went on strike for 3 years to get better rental rates and food prices, along with exemption from taxes and military service. They were successful in doing so. Right? I'm sure the students here at this college get terrific food and great rental rates. I'm sure there's no reason for them to be going on strike, but you can see. So these students were quite bolshy. Masters in the University of Paris pulled a similar stunt, using their weight of numbers to extract concessions from the papacy. So the universities, in short, were bottom-up if they were run by students, and still, in a sense, bottom-up if they were run by the faculty, as they were. So that's what we can say about their organisations. There are vestiges of this still, I think, in Oxford and Cambridge, where the universities at the undergraduate level are federations of colleges, and the colleges are governed by the faculties, the governing bodies of the faculties that comprise the fellows of the college, and the congregation of the university is the kind of democratic running. So there is a top-down attempt to impose authority on these. As vice-chancellors of Oxford and Cambridge have discovered, it's very difficult to do that, but nonetheless, that's the vestige of that old medieval system. Now, part of the distinguishing characteristic of the university was the provision of training at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels. At the undergraduate level, we had faculties of arts. At the higher level, the masters, above the master's level, the doctorate level, we have theology, law and medicine. Now, contrary to a common assumption, not every university had a theology faculty. So theology wasn't the main game of the universities, and many students, even when there was a theology faculty, didn't go on to study theology. So law was probably the most common higher degree, although some students just did a basic arts degree. So it's a little bit like the Melbourne model in a way, that you would have a generalist undergraduate training in liberal arts, and then if you wanted to go on to professional study, you would go on to a higher faculty. So the universities were involved in both general education and, in a sense, vocational training. What was in the undergraduate curriculum? At the higher levels, the law faculty essentially taught Roman law and canon law, church law. It taught medicine derived from ancient Greece via the Arabic translations of the 12th and 13th centuries. The undergraduate curriculum was essentially the philosophy of Aristotle. That's pretty much all they learnt at university was Aristotle, which is partly why I've been banging on about Aristotle. Now, there are various reasons why Aristotle was core to the university curriculum, which I won't go into, but essentially people at the time were just impressed by the incredibly comprehensive philosophical system that Aristotle had created. And as I say, the books of Aristotle, newly translated, formed the basis of the undergraduate curriculum from the middle of the 13th century. Aristotelian logic, as we will see, had a profound impact on the development of Christian theology, or perhaps we would say it contributed to the creation of Christian theology as a discipline. So that brings me to the second point. What was the queen of the sciences in the Middle Ages? Because the story we often hear is that theology was the queen of the sciences. As we've already seen, important to understand, not every university had a theology faculty. Not every student who studied at the university, therefore, would go on to study theology, and it tended to be a minority of students who did so. Was it the queen of the sciences? As we've seen, for Aristotle, his understanding of theology placed it at the top of the tree. But when Christian thinkers came to think about whether theology was a science at all, there were questions about that, because Christian theology didn't meet the strict criteria that Aristotle had set up for a true scientific form of knowledge, which, if you're interested in, entailed logically demonstrated conclusions from premises that were secure. Theology didn't have that because its premises came from Scripture. Now, as some of you will know, Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century Dominican thinker, found a way to get some scientific status for theology. But that's not the point. What I think was more interesting and more important was whether theology would be regarded as a theoretical science or a practical science. And the argument went something like this. If Christian theology was about knowing God, then it would be a theoretical science. But if it was about loving God, it was an active science, and it would be a practical science. And there was a division in the Middle Ages between essentially two of the orders. The Dominican order suggested it was theoretical, and the Franciscan order suggested that it is a practical science, the goal of which was to know to love God rather than to know God. So just to give you an example, here's Bonaventure, who is presenting the Franciscan position, as you can see there. And here's Aquinas presenting the Dominican position. So practical science in the first case and a theoretical science in the second case. So the point of this, I guess, is I'll come back to the question of, well, I'll come to this question right now. It's interesting in this context that the word theology is not used in Christianity until the 13th century. So there is a third option to these options, and that is whether Christianity should be concerned with a science of knowing that goes by the name theology. So as I've said, theology is invented as a term for what's happening in Christianity at this time. Prior to that, the usual expression was something like sacred teaching. And in addition to these scholastic discussions about the status of science, was an underlying discussion about whether we should think Christianity should be structured in these logical Aristotelian terms at all. So three different kinds of takes on theology. One that said it's really, if you're going to do that, really what you're doing is what that old pagan philosopher Aristotle was doing. There were others who said, well, no, actually there's something to this, but is it about loving God or knowing God? And I have to say that both of these characters were happy to concede that there were both practical and theoretical aspects to theology. So just want to highlight, because we're talking about God and the secular university and the status of theology, we can think about I suppose the point I want to make here is that there are worse things than not being given the status of science in a university, right? Because what conservative thinkers in the, if we come back to this, oh no, I'll just hold that thought. I'll come back to this issue about the status of knowledge and whether scientific status is the most important thing, and I'll do it under the context of the first crises of the humanities. And this is what I want to do very briefly by way of conclusion. I think the first thing we can say is that the remarkable dominance of Aristotelian thought in the undergraduate curriculum raised eyebrows among more conservative theological thinkers who worried that Aristotle's teachings had contradicted Christian teaching, and they did in some respects. Remember that issue, Aristotle's God doesn't create the world, Aristotle thinks the world's eternal. So there's a contradiction in the content, and there were worries that these forms of thought might get a foothold in the minds of undergraduates. And parallel to these concerns were now familiar tensions between the faculties, the faculty of theology versus the faculty of arts. And what happened in Paris then in the 13th century was that conservative forces managed to try and ban certain of the Aristotelian books. Some people argue that this is the kind of familiar pattern of the Christian repression of rational thought, but it wasn't that at all. For a start, these effects, the attempts to censure Aristotelian books just didn't work. They were short-term, and not least, of course, well, not least because of market pressures. So the University of Toulouse, which was founded in 2029, pitched itself to prospective students that they could study books of Aristotle there that Paris wouldn't let them study, right? Paris quickly capitulated, and so everything went back on the agenda. And I think the failure of attempts to ban Aristotle show the enduring quality of the synthesis between Aristotle and Christianity, but also the power and independence of the universities. But I want to return to this question about the scientific status, because I think we can generalise from that. So it's worth reflecting on this third option, and the two options, theology as a theoretical science, knowing God, theology as a practical science, loving God. And the critics of both of these wanted to argue that the true essence of Christianity lay in spiritual practices and not knowledge of either of those forms. And in a sense, this is then a division between what was essentially a monastic approach and a scholastic approach. Is it about spiritual practices, or is it about forms of knowledge? And interestingly, there's a parallel debate about the nature of philosophy too, with historians of philosophy now coming to realise that ancient philosophy was less about doctrines and more about practices. As one historian puts it, philosophy was then a way of life rather than a logical toolkit or a set of propositions about the world. So at issue here, to some extent, is whether the emergence of theology as a university discipline irrevocably changed the identity of Christianity. And I could say a lot more about that, and we can talk about it in the Q&A if you like, but looking forward to lecture 3, I guess what I want to say is that the acquisition of scientific status within a university may not be something you want. Right? It may not be something you want. And this is relevant to all kinds of practical and productive activities that might be better served outside the university context. And I can't say anything, I can't speak as a spokesperson for Indigenous ways of knowing, but I can simply point to the historical example of the way in which the introduction of theology and philosophy into the universities as formal disciplines was in some degree in tension with how they were previously understood. Right? So giving something scientific status changes what it's about, and the question is, Does it change it in a good way, or does it change it in a way that may not be entirely desirable? Last crisis that I want to talk about that's probably worth thinking about. The key figure in this second crisis, which takes place during the Renaissance, is Petrarch, the humanist scholar, and it's this guy who really originates the idea of the humanities. It was Petrarch's conviction that Western civilization was on the verge of collapse, owing to a fragility of its connection back to the classical period. He was a kind of Western Civ guy, and Western Civ was the Romans and the Greeks. What he thought was that this had been eclipsed by the scholastic curriculum, which focused on logic, and these were the things that were missing, right, that we didn't get in that scientific scholastic curriculum. So this first crisis of the humanities was a reaction against that formal medieval structure of the universities. And just to give you the kinds of things that they would say, Petrarch, who studied law for over 7 years, says, the law's fine, it's the lawyers that are the problem, right? So make of that what you will. Bruni, his contemporary, said, again, the study of the law has market value, you know, for what you get for it. But what it doesn't do, it doesn't make you a good person. And then here, this very interesting notion of usefulness. It's the second one that's useful, not the first one. It's not the sale value that's useful, it's the being a good person that is useful. And interestingly then, a contrast with theology, and this is a kind of almost a Reformation idea that theology is too logical and technical, and what we need to get back is to get back to the Church Fathers. So the common conviction of these Renaissance humanists reacting against what was taught in the universities was that the humanities had a usefulness that went beyond their market value. This was contrasted with the profitable training in law and theology. Now, more could be said on this, but 3 quick points. First, the humanities were born in a moment of crisis, and arguably they have been in crisis ever since. So there are perennial questions about the humanities that have never gone away. Second, the humanities in this case began outside the university before they existed in the ivy-clad walls of the universities. And third, the conceptions of the usefulness of different forms of knowledge vary from time to time. And this again points to the issue of what is it that we value as a society. Wrapping up the whole thing then, from the start, the universities had a place for secular knowledge in the philosophy of Aristotle. It was, for all that, this secular knowledge was regarded as deeply compatible with Christianity, and a lot of intellectual energy was expended in forging that connection. Also, from the beginning, universities were places that offered both an introductory general education and vocational training. Theology was by no means the dominant discipline and was not even taught in many universities. The question of both the nature and status of theology was contested, with some regarding it as practical, others theoretical, and some thinking it wasn't desirable as an activity at all. Finally, questions about the content of the curriculum and the balance between edifying and formative knowledge on the one hand and socially useful knowledge on the other have been an enduring feature of the business of universities since the 12th century. So tomorrow, for those of you who are still up for it, I'll turn to the topic of the rise of modern science and how, surprising as it may seem, science really had to struggle to show that it was useful and worthwhile. The humanities were for a long time in the driving seat, but science eventually got on top, and that's the story we'll tell tomorrow night. Thank you.
And just to I have a microphone. Turn it on. Right, that should work. Just to remind you, if you've got a question, please scan that code or type in that URL and type your question away.
We are set up in such a way that we can see the moderated questions appearing here. And if I plug the power in, the computer won't turn off, hopefully, while that's underway. So it falls to me to address the questions. So let's start with the first one, which I guess is directly relevant to New College, but asked by someone from another college. Are modern university colleges heirs of the ancient unis of scholars and students, and how can they endure and flourish in these modern times?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, that's the easy part. How do they flourish? To some extent, I'm going to talk about this in the third lecture, but to cut to the chase, and one of the problems we have, I think, at present, is a problem of scale. That our universities are just big, and they are impersonal, and that requires bureaucracy. And that wasn't the case in the past. And when I think to the Oxford collegiate system, which I know a little bit about, that seems to me the best modern day descendant of those old colleges. And what it's possible to do in those contexts is actually to generate a particular culture, right? It's not possible to generate those cultures, I think, large scale. So in terms of, are our modern colleges, some of them are and some of them aren't. Some of them are a dormitory with a refec attached, okay? And that looks after the basics. But I think what it takes for a college to be, a genuine descendant of those original ones is that it have a definite sense of what it's about, that the individuals involved work on the culture, and I'm sure that, I know that happens here. I've talked to, you need leadership with vision, right? And you need to generate the culture. And I think that's difficult to do at scale, right? And I'll come back to this question because as soon as we get large scale, we get impersonal bureaucracy, and that makes it very difficult to preserve the sorts of values and cultures that we need. But that's a theme that I will come back to. But in a way, to come back to the question, what I think we can say is that the college is the possible antidote to the large impersonal bureaucratic university. And a key thing is, if students are living there residentially, that makes an enormous difference as well. And that's why I think the idea of a university as a kind of distance education proposition is a very different one, where students live together. And that goes right back to the old idea of monastic communities, and indeed in the Greek tradition, philosophical communities. Sorry, long answer to the question, but yeah.
With theology being a postgraduate study, did that mean that laypersons had no access to theological studies? And was this a change from pre-universities, i.e. sacred studies were only limited to clergy prior to university formation?
Yeah, okay, good question again. Look, I think the key difference here is to think about, for medieval Christianity, the central thing was the ritual of the Mass, okay? It was about belonging more than it was about believing. And I'm not saying that the beliefs were unimportant, but this then takes us back to the question of the status of theology. If Christianity is about a way of life and a set of liturgical practices, then the theoretical stuff might be important, but it's not at the core, okay? So the question about lay access to theology to some extent assumes that there's a kind of hierarchical relation, that the theoretical knowledge that constitutes theology is the goal. But what the conservative critics of theology were saying was, actually, theology is not the goal. It's about ritual practice is the most important thing. Now, it doesn't follow that the theoretical truths aren't important. They are, but the Christian life in the Middle Ages essentially revolves around the ritual of the Mass, not about the profession of particular theological truths. So it was the case that the laity didn't ascribe to theology because that wasn't really the goal, okay? So that's as far as I can go with that one, but we may come back to that. I will say this. I think the Protestant Reformation makes a key difference. And the Protestant Reformation makes a key difference because it places much more emphasis on the propositional content of Christianity as opposed to the liturgical aspects of Christianity. But that was not true for, what happened in the Middle Ages. And for the Protestants, that was a problem, right? For the Catholics, it was fine, right? Although the Catholics upped their game in the theological stakes after the Reformation. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Could we say that both ancient and modern education were instrumental, with ancient education's end being human formation and modern education being human production?
Yeah, so I think this is what's picked up in the quote from Bruni, I think, who said that the most useful thing is the production of well morally formed human beings. And that's a very different conception of usefulness to a conception of usefulness that says the education is to produce professionals who can do this in the community because we need them. And I think both of those were present certainly in the Renaissance period, and it was still an open question as to, are both of those important? Yes, but I do think you can get people involved in the useful professions, as it were, who are nonetheless well morally formed as human beings. Now the question's disappeared off the screen, but I think Bill's just logging in. Bear with us. I think I've answered that question.
You seem to be... Wrong.
Oh, I think that was the next one. Yeah.
You seem to be conflating science as a medieval enterprise with science as a post-19th century idea. Please clarify the continuity and discontinuity as regards theology as a science and the rise and demise of the humanities.
Yeah, look, so I've written a whole book on this, so so let me say to the questioner, you need to read... No, I know this questioner's read this book. I'm not conflating them, but the point I think is well taken, is that science becomes a particular thing in the 19th century. It becomes what we understand it to be. Whereas in the Middle Ages, it was simply a form of knowledge, although, as I've indicated to you, Aristotle has a very formal conception of science, as he understands it, okay? And then there's a question of whether Christian thought can map onto that, right? Some people said yes and some people said no, and the people who said no often said, and all the worse for Aristotle's understanding of science. But as we'll see tomorrow night, when you come along tomorrow night, what I'll explain is how we move from Aristotle's understanding of science to experimental science, and then in the 19th century to a highly naturalistic, secular form of science. And those transitions, I think, are key to understanding where we are today. So the question, I think, is a good one, and it's worth bearing in mind that when Aristotle has an idea about science, that's different from the 17th century idea, that's different from the 19th century, and the transition through those is really key to understanding the place of science in the secular university today.
Thank you. The lost tools of learning appear to be the agenda of the more recent humanities. Are you suggesting the lost tools of ancient learning are actually contemplative practices that are able to be expressed in everyday community living?
Lost tools of ancient and more...
The lost tools of learning appear to be the agenda of more recent of the more recent humanities. I.e., I think there's a shift from how the ancients viewed learning to just being restricted to what happens in the humanities today. Here am I going. And are you saying that looking back to ancient times, they were aspiring to these contemplative practices which actually arose out of community living rather than sort of being specialised within the humanities disciplines as we see them in the university today.
Yeah. Look,
I hope I'm understanding. I hope I've interpreted that correctly.
Yeah. So look, I think the point is that if we think about both ancient philosophy and Christianity to be about contemplative practices, we're on the right track. And the shift that we see, and when I talk about secularisation and disenchantment, the shift that we see is as this sociologist Weber describes it, a move from otherworldly to this worldly. And so the things that are practical, everyday happenings, they become the priority in a way that they weren't before. And in the past, these things were necessary, but they weren't the kinds of things that contributed ultimately to human fulfilment, because human fulfilment consisted in transcending the things you had to do, okay? But now the things you have to do have kind of become the goal, and they have displaced this older contemplative understanding, okay? And it's very interesting to see the reasons, because I think there are religious reasons this happens. And again, this is essentially the thesis that the sociologist Max Weber elaborates, that Protestantism brings about a shift from the otherworldly to the this-worldly, its ideas of vocation. All of that places a stress on the here and now and the practical rather than the contemplative. And that distinction between the contemplative and the active lives is something I'll talk about more tomorrow.
Thank you. I noticed that the quote from Brunei seemed to advocate for skill in letters or rhetoric as an important area of study in addition to pure knowledge. Didn't the ancient Greeks also value rhetoric as well? What happened to that tradition?
Yeah, they certainly did value rhetoric. And I'm not sure what's happened to rhetoric, whether it's become critical thinking but rhetoric was the ability to persuade. And it's very interesting that, I think the greatest of the church fathers, Augustine, had his training in rhetoric. And when you read him, you can tell there's a quality to the writing that shows this ancient this ancient skill in letters. And that's what I think Bruni was talking about. But I'm not entirely... Okay, there was... Yes, so what happened to that tradition? I think what happened to that tradition is what happens to a lot of aspects in the past, that it's gone by the board. And part of that, getting at the very crude level, if you're doing this on your phone to communicate with people rather than standing up and giving speeches, there's going to be a degrading of, I think, in the content of the rhetorical content of what you're doing. But that's just part of the story. But efficiency in communication becomes more important than using communication for affect. And that is part of the growth of what I think is this instrumental rationality that focused on efficiency and some arid, narrow conception of rationality, as opposed to a broader conception of communication that addresses the whole person, including the passions. And the idea of rhetoric was that it engaged all of the person, not merely their intellect, but their emotion. And what I think is interesting to go back to Aristotle, we now simply buy this distinction between the intellectual and the ethical, whereas maybe that's an artificial distinction, and the intellectual and the ethical are more together than we think, and the tradition of rhetoric partly addresses that matter, I think.
Interesting, thank you. Is ChatGPT skilled in rhetoric? Does the division between theology as knowing God, as per the Dominicans, and theology as loving God, the Franciscans, map onto a distinction between realism and nominalism?
Tough question. And look, many of you will not know what realism and nominalism is, but look, I would say it doesn't map onto them, but it's well known in medievalists that the Franciscans had a philosophical position called nominalism, and the Dominicans tended towards another philosophical position called realism. And I think it's too late to go into that distinction at the moment, so I'll just say they're correlated, but they don't map onto each other. Yeah.
Here's some fun. Would Aristotle approve of transhumanism?
Well, as the politicians say, that's a hypothetical. Would Aristotle? Look, yeah, look. I think the short answer is no, because Aristotle has a conception of human nature as it were given, and Aristotle thinks that there is an essence to being human, and the idea of going beyond that is just completely nuts to him, because the idea is that you fulfill what is natural for you to do. Okay? Now, in the Christian tradition, the equivalent would be something like the image of God, and then so far as we're capable of manifesting that, then we are fulfilling our existence. But the idea that there's something you might actually add on to that, and that's the trans or post, in these schemes of things, that's just complete nuts, I think. So the short answer, no, he would not.
Terrific. I think we've come to the end of our question time, so please join me in thanking our lecturer.
Thank you.
And I'd like to call on Emeritus Professor David Cohen to come and move a vote of thanks, please.
So in wrapping up the first session in this year's New College Lectures, I'd also like to add my welcome to Professor Harrison on behalf of the university itself. One of the fundamental roles of a university, certainly the modern one, and I suspect the ancient one as well, was even an obligation to provide a public platform for leading scholars to address topics that are both interesting and important. And encourage us to think a bit more deeply on such issues. I'm probably biased, but I can't think of a more interesting subject than the origin, evolution, current state, and importantly the future character of the modern university. And I don't think we could have asked for a more distinguished scholar or deeper thinker to tackle those questions. Are the universities currently in an existential crisis? To an extent, certainly if you go down the other end of Cleveland Street, a few of the establishments down there, there is some crisis going on. UNSW seems to sort of sail past all these issues normally, not always. Peter addressed the turf wars between the faculties and between the universities and ecclesiastical authorities. It is comforting to know that nothing has changed in 10 centuries. I would really doubt that the meeting of the academic board of the University of Bologna in the 1300s, the minutes would read much differently to those in Australian universities today. Many of the issues we tackle are the same, but are the universities tackling those issues in the same way, or even knowing what issues we should be challenging or taking on? As to the growing momentum of secularism, I can look no further than my own beloved institution, following the comment that the Master made about the demise of a GE course in science and religion. I once semi-jokingly commented to one of the inhabitants of the first floor of Chancellery, there really are only two areas worthy of serious study in a university. There's geology and theology. And that the university was now deficient in the latter. The response was, that's exactly how it should be. Yet, a university here that has one of the strongest student Christian organisations in the country. Somewhat ironic. Tomorrow, Peter will consider change as the sciences thankfully moved into a more prominent place in universities. And on Thursday, Peter will address a matter or various matters which include rationalisation, bureaucratisation, and noting that UNSW is ranked 20th in the world in the QS, so I had to get that advertisement in, the dominance of metrics. I and many others will certainly be very keen to hear what Peter has to say on these matters. But for now, please join me again in thanking Professor Harrison for a wonderfully engaging lecture tonight.
And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's been fantastic to have our friends here in the room with us this evening, and also our many friends online. Look, just to conclude, I remind you of the bookstall down the front here, and Peter's book is on sale, as well as many other interesting monographs related to the topic. Supper will be served, and I believe it is it next door or here? It's just over there, so please stay and enjoy supper. Please stay and chat to other people that have joined us here in the room this evening. I'm sorry to those online, we can't do Uber Eats to your home, I'm afraid. But of course, please come back tomorrow when we engage in our next phase of the new 2025 New College Lectures. Thank you.